Thank you very much for the introduction, and I feel very honored to be here and have been invited to share with you my experiences in Cuba and in Bremen, and I present here also on behalf of the project teams. So we'll look a little bit into the CEFR and the alignment of language education so that we're just all on the same page, because I'm not sure who is in testing and who is more in education, so I'll just bring you all on the same page. Then I present you the two contexts and what we did and why we did it and the challenges we face in adapting the CEFR. Then in both contexts we had teacher training involved, and I want to share with you insights that the teachers gave us, feedback the teachers gave us on the training and the new assessment. And in Bremen I also have feedback from the students, and I'll end with the implications that we may be able to generalize beyond the two contexts. So first of all, when we talk about aligning language education to the CEFR, maybe I bore you with it, but I find it ever so important, and I think I reiterate in parts what Sarah shared with us earlier on. The CEFR is a language policy instrument. It doesn't tell us what to do. It sets the frame. It's a policy document. And it describes relevant aspects of learning, teaching, and assessment. And the CEFR originally has 9 chapters. Hands up, who has read the 9 chapters? That's what I feared. It's worth looking into it. It's still valid. It's still really valuable information. And it provides a common meta-language so that we can talk about what our learners can do and what we may want them to be able to do. But don't reduce it only to the scales. And the scale language in the descriptors is rather abstract. It's context and language independent. And that's what Sarah also said, the context matters. And I'll talk a lot about contextualizing. So bear that in mind, you will have to adapt the CEFR. It's not there to be used as it is. It's a tool, it's a workbench. So use it and adapt it. It provides a reference framework. And I liked Sarah's quote towards, it's not reverence, it's reference. And you can inform learning and self-assessment. The CEFR can inform teaching and curricula development, and it can inform assessment. But you have to make it work in your context. And the proficiency scales that now have been revised in the CV in the companion volume, they are at the heart of the CEFR, but the CEFR is much more than just the frame system, the scale system. But usually when we talk about adapting the CEFR, usually people mean the scale system, the proficiency system. And when we look at the scales and the descriptors, as I just said, they're a common framework. They provide a common meta-language. They are reference levels, and they're unspecific. You have to look at your context and the languages you're working in and your learners and their specifics. And the scales are not directly usable in teaching, learning, or assessment. There are no rating scales. You cannot go and rate one performance of your learners with a CEFR scale. So I think at the heart for me is the analysis of the local context. You have to look into the local needs, the purposes. Why is the CEFR adapted? What's behind it? What's the rationale? What's the learning context? What are your learner specifics? What's the learner group? What are the purposes of the education, what's the language use domain, and what are the local assessment needs. And once you've analyzed this and established the common grounds, then you can go into making the CEFR work for your context, and you come up with one possible interpretation. And you have specific local constructs, specific tasks that may be influenced by the local assessment or learning and teaching culture. You have specific criteria, and you may adapt certain descriptors from the CEFR. But you have to adapt them. And then you come up with differences to the original CEFR wording. And as long as you make it transparent, as long as you share with the world, this is my interpretation of, let's say, B1, then the world can compare and share their interpretations with you. So that's the approach I take usually when we adapt and we use the CEFR. And the constructive alignment cycle, Sarah started with the policy. I left out the policy. I jumped right into the curriculum, but the policies are behind the curriculum. The CEFR can inform your learning and teaching goals. It can inform which competences you may want to focus on. Then you go into the classroom, and the CFR can inform the action-oriented approach, learner-centeredness, but it won't give you the answers. You still need competent teachers who then will implement the curriculum in the classroom. You may want to assess formatively, summatively. You may want to use the CFR to inform your test specifications, your task design. And you do need training to develop valid tasks that operationalize certain aspects of the CFR, and you may also want training for delivery, for radar training, and you may want to link your feedback against CFR Inform so that you can actually feed it back into that learning and the teaching and the curriculum revision. So the CFR is at the center of the alignment circle, but it is informative. It's not telling you how to do it. It can only give you some information towards the elements that you need to fill. And if you do a formal alignment process, if you want to claim my exam measures student competence at B1 or my textbook is a B1 textbook, there is a lot of work behind that, and I think it's worth summarizing it here. And ALTI, EALTA, the British Council, UCALTA, anybody else I forgot, they all got together, pooled resources, and they brought out the CFR alignment handbook, and I think that is a really, really valuable resource, and it complements and widens nicely the existing manual for language, for linking language examinations, because it opens alignment to the whole educational context. So, and it's reiterated in the handbook that we have different phases. You start with familiarization. Everybody in the process needs to be familiar with the CFR, its categories, its levels, and then you go on to specification. Transparently analyze your textbooks, your materials, your tests in terms of relevant CFR categories. Tell the world why you think this is a test or a task or whatever material targeting a B1 learner. Then we need standardization. We need to train everybody involved so that we come to shared understanding. What does B1 mean for us in which context? And that's not to be doable without training and benchmarking. And particularly in high stakes contexts, you may want to do an official formal standard setting study where you determine the cut scores, where you determine the judgment, when has a learner reached a certain level, when has a learner passed a certain exam. And that's a formal endeavor with a lot of resources and expertise involved. And along with all these phases comes validation. You want to collect evidence for all the claims you make, and ideally make this transparent, bring it out into the open, into the public. Let exam users, textbook users see what you have done to support your claims. So that's the formal alignment procedure, and that sets the scene, so to speak. In this context, I now go into, excuse me, into two different local contexts where we adapted the CFR for quite different purposes, but interestingly we came across similar challenges and similar solutions. So the first context is Cuba, where we start with policy. The Ministry of Higher Education released a policy in 2015-16. They wanted to open up internationalization, and they wanted all BA students to leave university with a general English proficiency at level B1. They adapted the CFR, and that was before they contacted me. I have nothing to do with this. They adapted it. And they seek international recognition. They want a certification that is formally aligned to the CFR. And here training needs arise. The Cuban key players have to be familiarized with the CFR. They have a curriculum group. They developed a curriculum for higher education, and we have cross-references with this group, but I wasn't involved there. But we have people on both projects, and I was involved with developing the high-stakes assessment that should be aligned to the CFR. We started in 2017. The ministry dedicated about 40 teachers from all across Cuba, and you see, maybe you don't see, on the Cuban map we have red dots for all the different regions. And Cuba is a large country, it's more than 1,000 kilometers long, and so we had teachers from all the different universities. A brief outline of the project: it has 3 strands. We have one big strand of teacher training. We analyzed the local requirements. We provided training for theory and practice in testing and assessment, and how we align an exam and what it means to be at a CFR level and what a CFR is. And all the teachers in the projects were to become trainers in their local region because we wanted to bring the assessment approaches early on into the classrooms. And the second strand is developing the exam, and that's of course part of teacher training. So we trained all the teachers in all practical aspects, test specifications, tests, items, tasks, rating scale. We did benchmarking studies and rater training with them, and we will formally align to the CFR in the next round. And along with that, we have a research strand to look into all aspects of validation, into alignment studies, and we have already done a bit of research on how we develop the rating scales and into assessment literacy, and once the exam is live, we will accompany its impact and the sustainability. The overall plan, we started with planning the training and the project, and we started with training, then the teachers developed tests and tasks and rating scales. Until 19, we sought external and internal feedback, and then COVID hit, and during COVID they still managed locally there to do a little round of pre-testing. We did benchmarking exams. They're currently revising the tests and compiling an item bank, and now we are hopefully going into phase 2, where we want to do a larger scale piloting and IRT scaling so that we then can align formally to the CFR. I may reach out to one or the other of you when I need help for the standard setting judgments, and then they will implement the exam into the classroom and monitor its impact on teaching and learning. That's the plan, and we're halfway there. And a little bit into the local people. We did the first workshop. Yeah, maybe you can see some of the colleagues here in 2017, and ILTA supported this workshop. And then we went to LGRC with a group where I met Steve Senachi the first time in Bogota. That was all a long time ago. Then the teachers went off into regional groups to do the task development. We came back to another workshop. We did about 2 a year, and the teachers worked in between in smaller groups. And so far we managed 9 workshops. We started face-to-face, then we went online because of COVID. The last we tried hybrid, but it's a bit challenging in Cuba with the resources. And we did evaluate continually where we are and whether the teachers find it supportive, and we had 2 big evaluation points. I'll talk about that a little bit later. We had 2 big questionnaires to see whether the teachers gained enough knowledge and whether we met the teachers' needs. So I give you just a little example what we did in Cuba. We've developed a lot, too much that I can share with you here. But with regard to the test specs, we had 3 major sources. It's the curriculum that was locally developed and that was already referencing to the CFR. Then we went into the original CFR scales, and as soon as the companion volume came out, we went into those scales. And we used the Pearson scale of global English, the global scale of English, because they are geared towards higher education context, and they also cover the plus levels. And just one example for the reading test specs, the specific purposes that the test is to assess is the students can understand the gist of straightforward factual texts related to topics they are familiar with. You will recognize the CFR, that's for the overall reading comprehension scale. The students can scan longer texts to locate information. That's from reading for orientation, but also mentioned in the curriculum. We have the understanding main ideas and supporting details. That comes from the global scale of English and the curriculum. And we outline 9 different specific purposes for reading, and we do it for all the other skills as well. And they are then operationalized into test tasks, and the tasks are specified in terms of these specific purposes so that we can transparently show that's what we think this task is assessing. That's all I can share here for Cuba. We come back to Cuba in a minute when we look at how the teachers perceived the training and the delivery. Let's move to Bremen now, the languages center, which I direct there since 2015. Completely different context. We are in a city-state in the north of Germany, and we cater for 4 universities. We have about 6,000 students who attend our courses every year. We cater for about 20 languages, plus minus. And when I came, we realized we needed to reform the summative achievement tests. We have semesters of 14 weeks of teaching. So you cover maybe half a CFR level, but you cover it not in a comprehensive way. You can cover what you can cover in 14 weeks. So we are facing not proficiency, but achievement tests. And something said something here. Dev auto power off. I got 53 seconds left. All right. I hope we manage without this exploding. So in Bremen, we use the CFR as the framework. We want to constructively align teaching, learning, and assessment, and we take an action-oriented approach towards learning and teaching. Here comes help. Whoops. And give me a second. So we try and align the learning objectives, the teaching outcomes, and the assessment tasks in a transparent way. And yeah, super, many thanks. Mille, grazie. We started in 2016. We had up to 25 teachers on a voluntary basis. There's no point me as the boss telling them you have to, because if they don't want to, then I better not have them on board. But we managed to get people on board. We have 3 coordinators and researchers. And we did training similar to Cuba. We had workshops, we had external input, we had teacher conferences and also working groups in a similar range of topics. But the challenge was multiple languages. We had, as I said, about 20 different languages. What steps did we take in Bremen? We chose a collaborative approach between teachers, researchers, and coordinators. And we started revisiting the learning outcomes and the module descriptions. We then developed test specifications for all skills and all levels. We used German and English. That's our 2 working languages. But the test specs are valid for all the languages we teach. We tried to use the CFR wherever we found it feasible. Then we developed sample tasks and we tried them out low stakes in the classroom to gain insights. Do they work? What do the students think? And we specified them all in terms of what CFR features they operationalize. Then we developed assessment checklists. In Cuba, I said we have rating scales covering B1, a bit above, a bit below. In Bremen, we teach only 14 weeks and the rating scale wouldn't work. I'll show you an example why it wouldn't work as a rating scale. So we chose a checklist approach. I'll show you one in a minute. We then implemented in the classroom and we did a continuous evaluation. We asked the teachers, the coordinators, the students where we are going, whether we are on the right track and what they need. I'll talk about that in a minute. What was the overall design? Similar to Cuba, we started with a needs analysis. Teachers and students came up and said, this is not working, we don't have comparable exams, so we had a real need to revisit. Then we started with seminars and workshops. We did the first questionnaire early on to check what's the classroom practice on assessment, what is actually happening in the center, what needs and concerns do the teachers have. Then we continued with the workshops and added working groups to actually go into test development and specification development and benchmarking. And then once a year we had a questionnaire, and the other half year later we had an interview, focus group interviews to see how teachers implemented the new practices and what they needed, so that we actually could gear the training towards the teachers' needs and concerns. And that went on until 2019, and we had 3 major questionnaire events in these years, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And I'll give you now an example for Bremen. If we look at English for academic purposes, level B1, the first course on level B1, the overall learning outcomes, which are then broken down in further specific learning outcomes, are also geared towards that CFR levels. They can read and understand general texts related to their own subject, listening, general discussions, clearly structured academic presentations, and speaking. They can present and exchange factual information, participate in academic discussion, of course always in their own field. Writing, they can write clearly structured text, general topics, simple academic texts in their own field. And for writing assessment, I'll share with you part of the checklist. We have a checklist which contains 2 parts. One is task fulfillment, and the teachers can add the specifics because it's an achievement-oriented exam, so we have to gear it towards what's happening in the classroom. And for the language competencies, this is the checklist for cohesion and coherence, for vocabulary, and for grammar. And wherever we could, we resorted to the CFR descriptors. We tried to stick as close as we could to those proficiency descriptors. We are aware they're proficiency descriptors. And we married them with our achievement needs. Wherever we added space for the teachers to specify what kind of vocabulary, what kind of grammatical structures did they teach in the course. And you see we have 5 levels in the checklist, from very good to good, satisfactory, sufficient, and fail. That's the grand scheme in the German university system. And these 5 levels are broken down into 11 grades. I'm not going there. It's crazy, but I have to use the 11 grade system. So the teachers use the checklists, they share them with the students, and based on the checklist, they come to an overall judgment of the overall grade. And we did research into it, and it does work, and it works better than the intuitive grading that they used to do. So that's the German context, with the contextual constraints that we had to address. Now let me sum up the challenges that we faced when adapting the CFR. And I exemplified for the checklist and the rating scale development across both contexts, because we found quite similar challenges. We used a descriptor-based approach towards checklist and rating scale development. We used the CFR and CV descriptors, any assessment scales that we found in CFR-aligned exams, and the global scale of English. We came up with the first draft, then we used an intuitive approach, sorting exercises with the teachers, sort the descriptors back into the criteria and the level, so we see whether we reach a general understanding what the descriptor is actually describing. Then we did empirical approaches with data collection on benchmarking exercises, discussing where we digressed and what we have to change so that everybody is on the same page. And the challenges here were an abundance of scale in the companion volume. It was really hard work. In the instrument, you find similar aspects described in different ways. Have fun. So that was a challenge. We found different categorizations in the companion volume and in our context. So we had to do something about that. That's not the CV's fault. We just work in different contexts with different criteria. The plus levels aren't always described. And we found inconsistent wording across the scales and sometimes within the scales across the levels. And again, I'm not trying to say this could be done better. I know the complexity of the project behind compiling the CFR descriptors, and we just can improve and continue improving. So what were our solutions to these challenges? And these are published. I can give you the references so you can read up in more detail. So first of all, we reorganized the descriptors from the CFR into our local assessment criteria. Then we adapted the descriptors, we changed the wording to make the levels coherent for us in our local contexts. We added descriptors from other sources wherever we found nothing suitable in the CFR. And then we added and adapted descriptors to account for the local context. And that was both for the broad levels, the criterion levels, and the plus levels. We were free to change, and we documented clearly where we changed and where we relied on the CFR. Now, a lot of input, I know. Let's briefly really sum up and briefly look at what the teachers thought of the training approach. We used a responsive training and evaluation approach. We did a needs analysis. We delivered the first round of training. We had it evaluated by the teachers. We adapted it to suit their needs and their concerns, and that went on and on and on. And we used questionnaires. I'm not talking about the interviews today. That's too much for one session. We focus on the questionnaires today. So we wanted to look at the outcomes of the training program in both countries, and we had open items asking the participants for their perceptions of the program and their needs, and we had closed items so that we could look into the learning gains, and we based that on a publication by Kreml et al. And we had 3 points in Bremen and 2 points in Cuba with different numbers of participants. And unfortunately, I can't do a longitudinal study. We can discuss that later, why that didn't work. We analyzed these questionnaire answers for their perceptions of the feasibility of the program. We did a content analysis for common themes across both contexts. And we looked at learning gains in a descriptive analysis. And let's come to the perception of the training from the open answers. The collaboration was perceived as really, really helpful in the working groups. The teachers said the interacting, sharing, and giving feedback was really helping them to develop their assessment literacy and to develop tasks. And in Bremen, across a range of languages, in Cuba, across a range of universities. And I'd like to share one answer from Cuba, from the first questionnaire. I learned from my colleagues in my regional group. Negotiation, respect, and knowledge is so important in our group. So they really took to that working group and the collaborative learning and sharing. And then we saw positive effects of changes of assessment practices also in the classroom, in both contexts. Also in Cuba, where we are looking at a large-scale exam, but the teachers took it to their classrooms. And in Bremen, I have two teacher quotes. The one teacher said, the discussions in the working group have an effect on my teaching. And another teacher in that focus group says, I think the most important effect is that our teaching and our expectations are more or less comparable and are the same. That is an important thing for making sure, for standardizing, yeah, they serve us in all the teaching that we have. So all the discussions about assessment had an effect on their teaching, and we did link it back to the teaching all the time. And the practical focus was stressed as very, very important. And in Cuba, that we wanted the teachers to become trainers, so we asked them what was helpful, what would they need for training, and we had from the first questionnaire the feedback that the colleagues' motivation, the engagement in what I was bringing, the new visions of the teaching learning process, the tools that I received on the trainings which are now being spread, and the feedback that teachers said that was helpful to act in their local context and pass on the knowledge. What were the challenges of training? It didn't go without challenges, and in Bremen we had very different challenges from Cuba. The participation rate was a challenge in Bremen. I have a lot of hourly paid teachers. I cannot pay them and they're not coming for training. So that was a challenge. Timing was a challenge because in my languages center we have one course or the other running all the time. So we found now a nice way of reserving 2 days per half year, per semester to do training and to work together. And finding the right balance between theory and practice. And I did learn that with teachers, start with the practical aspects. And the theory, sneak it in when needed. Don't start with theory. I'm a more theoretical person, as you may have guessed. In Cuba, we had very, very different challenges. It's travel and access. The country is really in dire needs, and that was a real challenge. The technological limitations for online collaboration proved a challenge. And we had stakeholders on board who are not with a language teaching background, so we had to get them on board. And that was challenging, but I think we managed. Just briefly looking at the learning gains in Bremen. I'm just summing up here now. I'm not going into detail. I base it on the last questionnaire, and I'll just give you the top five learning gain areas that my teachers reported. From the training events, it was constructive alignment. Yeah, so the training did work. They learned a lot about constructive alignment. And then test specifications, evaluating tests, developing checklists, and theoretical aspects, reliability, validity, and authenticity. So theory is not all without its place. And from the working groups, of course, it was more practical aspects, test specifications, checklists, and test items development, but constructive alignment and implementing the CFR for assessment are amongst the top five. So I hope the training did achieve some of the goals. And overall in Bremen, did we reach the goal to increase authenticity of the assessment, transparency, and comparability? We asked students with the writing tasks particularly, and they said that they have a higher level of authenticity now. So I think, well, that's good. That's what we wanted. The teachers and coordinators say the alignment to the CFR of learning, teaching, and assessment and the test specs lead to more transparency and comparability. That's good. But the new ways of exam development, of using the checklist, it did take us a lot of time and a lot of effort. So we have to build that into the program. And for our external accreditation body, that's UniCert, the alignment also adds transparency to our exams and makes life easier for everybody. So for Bremen overall, I think it worked nicely. If we look at Cuba, we are still in the middle of the project. We had the top 5 areas from the latest questionnaire, and they had a 4-point Likert scale. 1, I didn't gain anything, to 4, I did gain a lot. And Cuba, the people are very polite, and they were very, very happy and grateful that I came and worked with them. So maybe we have to take that with a pinch of, maybe it's too high for what they really learned, but maybe not. So they learned assessing productive skills, development of test specifications, application of the CFR, and knowledge about the CFR. And that was in the workshops. And when we look at the regional groups, the learning gains are a bit lower, but still application of the CFR and knowledge about the CFR rank amongst the top 5. So I'm very happy with that outcome, and I hope we can continue. And I'm going now to the last part of my presentation to the implications. What can we take away? Is there anything we may generalize beyond the two very specific contexts? In general, if you like to embark on such a project, I may state the obvious. You may all be trainers and very competent in doing that, but familiarization with the local context, with the institutional constraints, with the key stakeholders, and with existing professional development initiatives is ever so important, that you hit the ground running and you know what's going on in the different contexts. Then including all the stakeholders from day one onwards, and make it possible that everybody brings their expertise. It may take more time, it may take several rounds of discussion, but it's important to have everybody on board. Otherwise, you end up with a nice exam and nobody wants it. So that's very important. And the time. We have to schedule a lot of time. It took all longer than I had envisioned, and also the ministry in Cuba had envisioned, but we have learned that things take time, and if you don't take everybody on board, it's not gonna work. And the collaboration, as we heard from the teachers, the regional groups, the collaboration is ever so important. Create spaces online or in the real world, face-to-face. That's important, that everybody can work together, see each other, and form a community of practice. And the experiential starting point, the practical starting point is really important. Make it work, that the teachers see why they're doing what they're doing and how they can take it into the classroom, and provide theory as you go along. And some more specific focus on the CFR. How can you implement it? What can we take away? I think the familiarization exercises are so important, and Sarah pointed out the newly structured homepage with all the resources. Make this available in advance. Let people do it in their own time in small groups, that they can familiarize themselves. Give them a bit of guidance, but allow them to use their own approaches in their own ways, with a bit of guidance, but give time in advance, that people aren't overwhelmed with all the materials that are already there and existent. Choose a collaborative approach, let them bring their needs and their ways of working with these materials to the table. Hands-on activities are ever so important, that it's not only theory, here's a scale and there's a scale, but give them the scales, break them down, let them work with the scales, and pre-select the scales. There's too much in a CV for a workshop. Teachers will just back off because it's too much. Get together with a smaller group of organizers, of responsible key stakeholders, and select a few things that you think are most relevant in that context. Use other sources. The CFR doesn't hold all the answers. We have another project of integrated assessment, and in the CFR, if it says can summarize a text in a summarization scale, it doesn't help me, because I want to know what makes a good summary. So you may have to look into different scales and different sources of information. Document everything transparently, so that in the end you can still say, this is where the CFR comes in, and this is what I needed in addition. And co-develop learning goals, curricula, and assessment goals. Do it in a group, do it in different groups, but make sure they collaborate with each other. And when it comes to developing learning activities, teaching tasks, and assessment tasks, also think of them all in a comprehensive way. Don't do it in different silos. And I think that's all I can share in that little time. And here